You are listening to CNI Jerusalem Calling, your source for uncensored news and analysis on the Middle East. I'm your host today, Anna Baltzer, CNI board member and full-time lecturer, author, and organizer for a just resolution to the Israel-Palestine conflict. I'm the author of Witness in Palestine, a Jewish-American woman in the occupied territories, and producer of the film Life in Occupied Palestine, Eyewitness Stories and Photos. Both can be found on CNI's website, www.cnionline.org, along with much more. Jerusalem Calling is a project of the Council for the National Interest, working for a new direction of fair U.S. policy towards the Middle East. Welcome, everyone, to the show. We have an exciting guest with us today. Akiva Eldar is an Israeli journalist, author, and chief political columnist and editorial writer for the Israeli national daily newspaper Haaretz. Eldar is a consultant for CBS News and a regular guest on CNN. His columns are often featured in the Haaretz International Herald Tribune edition and the Japanese daily Mainichi Shimbun. Eldar's interview with Yasser Arafat in July 2004 was the last the Palestinian leader gave to the Israeli media, and he was also the first Israeli journalist to interview Mahmoud Abbas when he became the first Palestinian prime minister in 2003. Eldar served previously as spokesperson for former mayor of Jerusalem, Teddy Kollek, and then as a reporter and editor of the Israeli Public Radio. Eldar has been with Haaretz since 1978, including 10 years as diplomatic correspondent and 3 years as U.S. bureau chief and Washington, D.C. correspondent, reporting on the peace process and U.S. relations, among other things. Eldar has co-authored 2 books, a biography of Shimon Peres, and his most recent book, Lords of the Land, The War Over Israel Settlements in the Occupied Territories. Mr. Eldar, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Could you start off by telling us a little bit about your latest book about the settlements?
This book that was published at the end of 2007 is called The War Over Israeli Settlements in the Occupied Territories from 1967 to 2007. I co-authored it with Professor Edith Zertal. It took us about 2.5 years to do this research with some help from American friends, actually, such as our friend Phil Wilcox, the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, and other good people. This is actually the first, and I believe the only book that offers a full account of the very special symbiotic, I would say, relationship between the various Israeli governments since 1967 until today, and bring some documentation as well as interviews and analysis of the different interests that are involved in those relationships, the contribution of the military establishment as well as the legal establishment, let alone the political parties, in the efforts to create facts on the ground that will make the two-state solution, or if you like, the green line, the 67 line, completely irrelevant.
Talking about the polarization of Israeli society, and we'll also be talking a little bit more about the future of the two-state solution, but just to focus on that wide distribution of Israeli thought on the issue, you have written more than 2,000 articles in Haaretz and other newspapers about Israeli policy, and many of them very critical. What is it like to be an Israeli journalist that can criticize the government? Is it acceptable? How are you treated? What's it like the day after you publish something very critical?
It's a very interesting question, because I'm asking myself if people like Gideon Levy, Amira, and myself are not actually helping the occupation, that we are the fig leaf of the Israeli democracy. I'm sure that even Prime Minister Netanyahu, as well as Ehud Barak and others, using our articles to show that Israel is an open society, of course, unlike some of our neighbors, and there is freedom of press, freedom of expression, and here you go. This is a democracy that can at the same time pursue and keep the occupation and a closure on 1.5 million people. So in a way, I sometimes feel that we are also players in this nasty game.
It's often used...
You didn't expect this answer.
Well, no, it's not the first time I've had that thought, but I give a lot of talks on this issue, and people frequently bring that up, saying, well, but look, in Israel, people are allowed to say what they want, so doesn't that mean it's a democracy? Of course, not mentioning the fact that Palestinian citizens of Israel do not have equal rights, the fact that the majority of Palestinians under Israeli rule don't have any rights, basically, in the occupied territories. But this is oftentimes used and twisted to show that, in fact, Israel is virtuous, rather than reading the words that you guys are actually saying. Is it true, is it even a fair characterization to say that the press is completely free? Are you able to truly say whatever you want?
Absolutely, yes. I can tell you that in 32 years that I've been working for Haaretz, and even 4 years working for the Israeli NPR, I never had to even argue with my editors, trying to convince them to let me publish anything, whether it is strictly a news piece or opinion piece. That's something that I really have to appreciate, that I get, of course, hate mail, mainly from American readers, actually, more than from Israelis and from settlers. But I'll tell you a secret. While doing the research for the book, even the settlers were willing to meet with us and respected us. This is something I still cherish, and this is one of the things that gives me some hope.
It certainly is a very good thing, and oftentimes Israeli journalists like you and Haas and Levy who expose a lot of what's going on to the rest of the world. I did read, though, an interview you gave with Amy Goodman on Democracy Now!, and there was an allusion to you're not really being able to talk, for example, about Israel's nuclear program. Is that still the case? That is an example, perhaps, of censorship.
This is an exception. You know, whenever we refer to the Israeli so-called nuclear power, we have to say so-called, or according to the foreign media, which I believe is, what we do in Purim in Israel, in the holiday. So this is a Purim spiel. Everybody knows exactly what happens in Dimona, that it's not textile industry.
Okay.
So we are playing the game. It's not that bad, but there is still in Israel an open discussion whether even this kind of ambiguity over the nuclear policy in Israel is right or wrong. This is a real exception.
The fact that is really the exception, it's such a strong contrast to here in the United States, where I'll go and talk to editorial boards, and they will say, look, even if we wanted to publish what you're telling us, we're going to be inundated with angry letters, and we're not going to have support from people on the other side, and a real fear that it won't sell newspapers and that it is unacceptable. And I have met with journalists who either just simply don't want to report on it because they don't like hearing it or they don't believe it, or they even want to report on it and don't feel that they can. They don't feel they can keep their jobs, and they don't feel like they can continue to sell articles. So it really is quite a big difference. I was thinking about the comparison between that and also what I experience if I go and lobby, for example, in U.S. congresspeople's offices, that oftentimes their response will not be, well, I think we should support Israel unconditionally because it never does anything wrong, but rather, I may agree with what you're saying, but I do not feel safe and comfortable in doing anything other than supporting Israel because of the backlash that I will receive. Can you tell us your thoughts on the Israel lobby? Of course, this being the primary, I think, reason for that response, for the perspective of Israelis of the Israel lobby.
I had the honor to be on a few panels in the very impressive J Street conference in Washington back in November. And it was very impressive. They had a turnout of more than 1,500 people. They had a very impressive group of Israelis from different parties, from Kadima, Labour, and Meretz. And I think that this is a turning point in the relationship between Israel, whether people like it or not. I mean, people in AIPAC and our ambassador in Washington that decided to boycott this very important event.
We'll continue after the break. You are listening to CNI Jerusalem Calling. I'm your host, Anna Baltzer. We're talking with Israeli journalist Akiva Eldar. Mr. Eldar, I apologize for cutting you off before. You were talking about the J Street conference that you had attended.
The point I was trying to make is that maybe this is an illusion or a wishful thinking, but my feeling is that things have changed since this conference and perhaps since J Street was established. Actually, once the Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Olmert, and then Benjamin Netanyahu made the clear statement that a Palestinian state is not a dirty word, is kosher, I think that they opened also a debate in the American Jewish community that for many years heard a different message from the Israeli right-wing camp.
I'm an American Jew, and I have spent a lot of time watching the way that perhaps American Jewish opinion has changed slowly but surely, and it does continue to change on this issue. And certainly the turnouts and the support for alternatives to AIPAC here in the United States is growing at an unprecedented rate. And I, too, have become wrapped up in the excitement of a possible change. And of course, I have to mention that CNI, Council for the National Interest, is also working on changing U.S. foreign policy for the better. But then I go to Israel-Palestine. I see the situation on the ground, and I see the way that, in spite of the growing pressure, Obama's calls have been essentially dismissed. What are your thoughts in terms of not just what you see in terms of the climate changing among the public, but actually on the ground and in terms of what the government is actually doing? Obama just finished his first year in office. Any comments on his efforts towards a resolution?
I'm sure that you'll find that many Israelis as well as American Jews were very relieved when they realized that in the State of the Union, the president didn't even mention Israel.
Yeah.
Okay? Let alone Palestine and the Arab-Israeli conflict. I am not one of them. And I think that this should bother us. The fact that the president may have given up on us. I don't believe that we can reach any settlement with the Palestinians on final status without an American, not just the Americans serving as facilitators, but before the Americans will put forward their own blueprint, and before the President of the United States will put his foot down or put down the telephone number of the White House like James Baker did in 1992, saying, call me when you're ready. And until then, forget about loan guarantees. I don't see any strategy right now in, unfortunately, strategic thinking in our government. Right now, the price that Benjamin Netanyahu and his colleagues in the government have to pay for the status quo is much lower than the price they will have to pay if they decide to move forward and remove outposts and tackle the settlers.
This is sort of, I think, a mystery to a lot of Americans that certainly we know that there are Israelis who support the settlements. We also, however, many of us who have been there or read a lot, know that many, many Israelis are also against the occupation. Why is it so that Netanyahu would face worse consequences ending the occupation when, according to polls, the majority of Israelis are critical of the occupation? And more generally, not just with Netanyahu, that for a long time this has been the case, that many Israelis oppose the occupation, and yet the leaders elected and the situation on the ground simply continues to deeply ingrain the occupation as opposed to pull it out.
Let's start with this. Many of my colleagues are saying that people like me should be very proud of themselves and pleased with the fact that now the idea of a two-state solution of a Palestinian state is not a dirty word anymore. And everybody says things that when we said in the 80s was considered almost treason. I think that this is counterproductive, actually, because behind those words there is nothing. Netanyahu realized that by spelling out the magic words, he's off the hook. And he can say, you see, I'm the good guy. Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas refuses to sit with me. I did what I did in Bar Ilan. And as long as Benny Begin, Lieberman, Yalon, the ideologists, people whom I give the credit that they will not sit next to Netanyahu 1 minute once they will realize that he's serious about getting out of the occupied territories and dividing Jerusalem. This is my ultimate litmus test. Is as long as they are sitting there, Netanyahu can't be serious. I don't see any kind of formula that can satisfy both Mahmoud Abbas and Benny Begin. So I believe that this is one of the most sophisticated, nasty tricks that we have seen since the Barack's no partner, and that was followed by Bill Clinton's narrative that it was Arafat's exclusive fault that Camp David has collapsed.
What about not just within the government, but the average Israeli? When I think about millions of Israelis who want to see a change, and then in the next election, Netanyahu being elected. What gives? What's going on here? Why would Netanyahu be elected if Israeli public opinion is as it is? Is there a priority? Is there something more important to them than ending the occupation? Is ending the occupation not as important as it was before? Is it not something worth sacrificing for? What explains the election results year after year?
I believe that what explains it is that the average Israeli believes that the problem is not Netanyahu, and the problem is not the Israeli unwillingness to get out of the territories. We are the good guys. We are willing to go the extra mile. Barak offered them everything, and they have turned to violence. This is the narrative of the man in the street in Israel. So it's kind of righteousness. They will tell you about, I briefed today a group of Americans from a certain group that is visiting Israel. And I heard from them again and again the same kind of narrative that Barak and Bill Clinton and Dennis Ross and some others were rubbing in for so many years. And this spin really works. It's very difficult to convince people that Netanyahu is not serious. They really believe that Netanyahu wakes up every morning and says, "Where is Mahmoud Abbas? I'd love to hug him." And, he lets me down. And people buying it. And on top of it, I don't know if you saw my last op-ed, he has got the best salesman in Israel, Mr. Shimon Peres, on his side.
Right. I know you wrote an entire book about Peres, but just for a basic understanding, I think a lot of people see Peres as a peacenik, someone who won the Nobel Peace Prize and has really struggled to improve the situation. Do you agree with that analysis?
No, absolutely not. I think that Peres, in the best case, since he's the president, and I have to watch my tongue in this case, but he was and still is first and foremost a politician before a statesman. And he is a very talented person, a very eloquent speaker, but I don't believe, I put it this way, that peace is on top of his agenda. What is on top of his agenda is Shimon Peres.
He's certainly the type who would, I think, perpetuate those myths that you were talking about that the Palestinians are the greatest obstacle to peace and that the problem is the Palestinians and the problem is Palestinian violence. Of course.
Last week he said to the Norwegian foreign minister, he told him that he just called Abu Mazen and warned Abu Mazen that if he will not move forward, there will be a third intifada. Instead of calling Mr. Netanyahu, he calls Abu Mazen.
All right, well, we'll get back to that after the break. Today we're speaking with Israeli journalist and author Akiva Eldar. We were talking a bit about some of the myths that are perpetrated by people like Shimon Peres and also very widespread among other people, and I think they're particularly prominent oftentimes here in the United States. Sometimes we are even a little bit backwards. We tend to revise these myths later than Israelis themselves do. One of the big myths, of course, is that Palestinians only use violence. If only a Palestinian were to use nonviolence, were to use the way of Gandhi or Martin Luther King or Nelson Mandela, then wouldn't that be extraordinary? And of course, as I'm sure you know, and as I've seen on the ground myself, Palestinians are using nonviolent resistance constantly. Many ways, and in places like the village of Belin, where people will march week after week down to the land that is being threatened by the wall to bear witness and to protest and to march alongside Israelis and internationals, and it's quite an extraordinary thing to see. But the organizers of these movements seem to me to be systematically targeted by the armies, and just last night, about 2 a.m., Mohammed al-Khatib, which is main organizers of the Billion Popular Committee Against the Wall and Settlements, was arrested by the Israeli military. Abdullah Abu Rahma has been now in prison for more than a month, and he is also one of the main organizers in Bilin. What is the significance of this targeting of Palestinian nonviolence?
I believe that 3 years was almost no terrorism. Israelis are back to this old illusion of enlightening or liberal occupation, that what Netanyahu is calling the economic peace. And they believe that if it will be quiet and they will remove few checkpoints and the Palestinians will be able to get maybe some foreign investments and improve the economy, and build a kind of homeland in Bantustan, we are off the hook. They are really afraid of a nonviolent resistance. Look at Sheikh Jarrah. Every Friday, you have the police arresting Israelis, including the director of the Israeli civil rights organization, Chagai Elad, and some other peace activists. It seems that sometimes they are more afraid of a kind of a Nelson Mandela struggle than a violent intifada. They really don't know how to handle it. With violent intifada, they know that you get the images of Palestinians blowing up Israelis in buses, and then the international community and even the United States will tolerate an Israeli retaliation against them, and even what happened in 2002 with going back to Area A and occupying the territories and putting back the closure and actually arresting Arafat in his office in the Muqata. And the American administration turned a blind eye and tolerated it. A nonviolent struggle is something that that they are not familiar with. It's something that will confuse them, as is confusing them.
The Archbishop Desmond Tutu, of course, from South Africa, also visited Bil'in. And, of course, Bil'in is just one of many, including Sheikh Jarrah and also so many
I
other
interviewed him
villages.
right after that, yeah.
Oh, did you? And he has, along with others from South Africa, even described the situation in Palestinian areas as being even worse than apartheid in South Africa. Would you agree with that description, that Palestinians are really living under a kind of apartheid system?
If the definition of apartheid is not just exclusively the South African model of apartheid, it's absolutely true. If apartheid is dividing societies on the basis of nationality, it doesn't really matter if it's a basis of nationality or on race, on color. Take this famous 443 highway between Tel Aviv, Modi'in, and Jerusalem, which was now discussed in the Supreme Court, and the ruling is that after 5 months they have to reopen it to the Palestinian movement, Palestinian vehicles as well as pedestrian.
Again, the illusion of the democracy where with a good fight they get justice.
Yeah. So if you have separate roads for Palestinians and for Israelis, but there are Israelis that will argue it is not apartheid because Israeli Arabs are allowed to use those roads. It's a basis of citizenship. It's not on the basis of nationality. I don't buy it, and I think that Road 443 is an apartheid road.
And given that apartheid analogy, and of course the UN defines apartheid independent of South Africa, so we are right to use that definition in terms of the separation of societies. And also just to comment that, yes, I mean, anyone with a yellow license plate, an Israeli license plate, can use that road. Who are the Israelis who are living in the West Bank? The Israelis living in the West Bank are Jewish Israelis, the settlers, and so de facto it oftentimes does end up being one kind of road if you're Jewish and one kind if you're Muslim and Christian. But either way, it is a system of separating populations. Given that comparison, and also given the diplomatic efforts for so long, largely because of the Israel lobby and other things, have so little on the ground, do you think that there is a role for grassroots organizing? There are a lot of Israelis coming out in support of boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel called for by Palestinian civil society. Is there pressure being felt from this campaign? Do you see Israel as becoming a sort of pariah state in the world community?
I think that this would have happened a long time ago if the international community, the Europeans, and maybe even the Americans have got the complex of the guilt conscience from the Holocaust. If Israel was an ordinary country, not a country that was established on the reminiscence of the terrible thing that happened to the Jewish people in Europe, I think that the international community wouldn't have tolerated it. Even the EU, which has a very close relationship and interest in the Arab world and in Iran, is very careful. I don't have to mention Germany, even the British government. They're very careful because once you criticize Israel, you are taking the risk of being labeled not as an anti-Israeli, but as an anti-Semite. And I think that there is some anxiety over there.
But the movement itself of boycott, divestment, sanctions has been growing not of course, in diplomatic circles, but definitely on the ground. And I have read Israeli reports that it has become perhaps more of a threat to the status quo than diplomatic efforts have ever been. Do you have that sense, and do you think that there is a role for that kind of grassroots organizing in bringing real substantive change on the ground?
I don't think that the Israelis will, at the end of the day, volunteer to divide Jerusalem and to give back the territories they have vested interest in the 300,000 people who live there, in the cheap land that they can provide to young couples that cannot afford to buy a house in Jerusalem or in Kfar Saba inside Israel. I think that it will not just happen out of the blue. The Israeli people will do it, unfortunately, like we did giving back Sinai, only after, hopefully this will not happen, I am very careful, another round of violence or pressure from the international community, as you said, that will make them pariah and will make them being ashamed of being Israelis.
Thank you. We'll be back after this break. We were talking before about the comparison to South African apartheid. And, of course, in the case of apartheid, the solution that was promoted by the Black South Africans themselves and much of the world was not one of separating into one state for Black South Africans and one state for white South Africans, but rather a state for all its people. In your article, If I Were a Palestinian, in Haaretz last April, it seemed, and I would like to hear your comments on this, that you were advocating that Palestinians actually transform their struggle from a national one into more of a civil rights struggle, demanding equal rights rather than a separate state of their own. And just a few days ago, Israeli political scientist Meron Ben-Venisti's article in Haaretz called The Inevitable Binational Regime reiterated his and many others' claims that things are moving towards a binational state. Can you explain more about your article and comment on Ben-Venisti's?
You know, this is not new. Ben-Venisti have been writing about the irreversibility of the occupation in the 70s, before there were settlements. Ben-Venisti, in my view, is not a Zionist. I'm not saying it's in order to blame him. There are people who are entitled to be non-Zionists and even anti-Zionist. I, as a Zionist, and not only as a Zionist, as someone who believes that the Jewish people have the right for self-determination, as well as every other nation, and I am completely agnostic. I am speaking as a Jew by nationality. I believe that Meron Ben-Venisti has been in a different place for many years. What he is suggesting, a one-state solution, or a binational state solution, will eventually lead us to people like me, Jews, to live in an Arab state. Because, as you know, the Arabs are doing much better than we do in bedrooms. So eventually there will be an Arab majority here. And if I have to choose between living in Palestine or living in Australia, I'd rather live in Australia. My parents came to Israel in the 30s as Zionists before the Holocaust because they wanted to build a Jewish state. What's the point of living here if it's not a Jewish state? With, of course, a Palestinian state next to us, based on the 67 borders. More than that, Yasser Arafat made a historic move, and he paid the price for it, dividing the PLO, accepting the idea of a two-state solution. So we are now saying, no, well, let's go back to a one democratic, secular Palestinian state, because the idea is not to have a binational state. Can you show me where it works after 100 years of animosity? How much blood was shedded in the Balkans? And in Cyprus, are they able to reach an agreement over a binational state?
Certainly, many people would argue, for example, that there are, first of all, of functioning binational states. Just Meron Ben-Venisti actually talked about binational states such as in Canada with Quebec and in Belgium, but certainly in terms of a history of animosity, there are also examples.
I don't remember there was bloodshed. Yeah, I don't remember that there was bloodshed.
In South Africa, for example, or in the United States, where you had a history of complete segregation and then becoming actually living in one state. Certainly it's not perfect in either place, but the question for me is not what sounds ideal, but is it possible to maintain the Jewish state and a two-state solution and offer full equal rights to anybody who has rights to the land and not discriminate against them?
I believe that the current leadership, headed by Abu Mazen and the other Palestinians whom I know, are willing and able to build a country, especially Salam Fayyad, next to Israel, and this should be based on mutual interest. If the Palestinian state will not be viable, if we will put security as the dominating factor and will strangle them and will not allow them access to the sea and will keep controlling Jerusalem, including all the holy sites, it will not work. Of course, it has to be based on a balance. It has to be a balanced agreement, a fair agreement. It has to take into consideration also the refugees. But I can't tell you that I believe that the two-state solution will definitely work. It's not a perfect solution. You read probably the report in Haaretz about those hooligans who entered the Palestinian village and did a pogrom there. The Israelis who will stay in the settlements in Palestinian cantons, because it will have to be kind of autonomy, will do everything to provoke their settlers. It's not the good people. It's not people like me who are going to move to Nablus or to Hebron. It's the troublemakers. And they will make sure to prove that it doesn't work. We will be doomed to balkanization of the West Bank. Like what happened in Gaza. At the end, we had to get them out of there. It was hell.
We have an email question that came in from John Hovsepian. John's asking you, Dr. Eldar, should the U.S. recognize Palestine as an independent state before borders are set?
It's a very good question, and probably this question will be put forward maybe to the UN, to the entire international community, not only to the United States. This is what actually Salam Fayyad has in mind, to build a state bottom up, and once it will look like a state, it will function like a state, it will deserve to be recognized as a state. So it's not a theoretical question. That's why I'm saying it's right to the point. Let's say that the United States will recognize a Palestinian state. State needs borders. Without borders, the UN cannot recognize a full-fledged state. We need to negotiate the borders. Otherwise, we can't go to the 67 borders. Take, for instance, if you drive today to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv, on Route 1, on the main road from the highway from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, you are crossing no man's land. This was part of a no man's land. It didn't belong to Israel before 67.
I'm going to have to cut you off right there. Certainly, the lack of borders has not prevented the UN from continuing to recognize Israel, so we hope that perhaps the same will be for Palestine. Thank you so much, Mr. Eldar, for joining. Eldar, for joining.